what kind of job you did with in Rwanda with President Paul Kagame.
My name is Theogene Rudasingwa, and I'm a native of Rwanda, needless to say, and I've had quite a long journey, and having been born in Rwanda at the beginning of the 1960s, and I met President Kagame along the way during the struggles of the 1990s. Once again, because we're both refugees, and in the course of that struggle of the Civil War and the tragic events that followed, I've had a number of responsibilities, both in the struggle as a spokesperson or diplomatic emissary to many, many countries and organizations. And I became the General Secretary of the now ruling party, Rwandese Patriotic Front, became ambassador to the United States after the genocide, and the last responsibility I had was to work as the director of cabinet, which is sometimes referred to as the chief of staff of President Kagame, until the end of 2004 when I ran into exile. So that is more or less the span of my life, and since then, of course, I've been living in exile in the United States.
So you talk about the struggle, you were part of this movement of young Rwandans at the time in exile in Uganda. You, among others, and President Kagame, then he wasn't president, but he was part of the movement. Tell me a bit about what you remember about being in the RPF during that time and during the genocide.
What I remember is that the RPF was an organization that was born just in time. And I say just in time because, as I briefly mentioned in the introduction, we're the sons and daughters of people who had been banished from our country since the process of decolonization from Belgium and Rwanda gaining independence in 1962, and a Hutu revolution that had essentially ended centuries-old monarchy in Rwanda, and we happen to be Tutsis. And so it's these sons and daughters who had been living in exile for almost 3 decades that simply took the matter into their own hands through an invasion that began on the 1st of October 1990 and invaded Rwanda in order simply to go back home. So the RPF essentially, although of course we had a political program, essentially it was a movement of going back home after 3 decades of exile of Tutsis. And so one thing I recall is the excitement of setting foot, yes, under difficult circumstances of an invasion, because this was a political military struggle, but there was a lot of excitement that we are going back home. I simply remember the thrill of crossing the border for the first time, into Rwanda, and the rest of that story, of course, since there was a civil war and then the genocide. In retrospect, it was always a bitter truth, but I cannot forget the kind of excitement we had at the very beginning.
And what was it for you as a young man at that time, crossing from Uganda into Rwanda, a country of your birth, but a country that you and your family hadn't seen for so long? What was it like for you at that moment?
It was, I cannot really fully capture the sentiment of that moment, except to say it was kind of maybe hysterical amongst young people, or excitement, or euphoria. The English would probably have a better word for describing something like that. And it was excitement because we simply felt we were going back home. And it didn't matter at that point in time. Of course, we're young. I did not have a wife at that time. I didn't have children. And it was one of those moments in life where you say, if I die, I die, but this is the kind of cause I'm willing to die for. And of course, the other side of the matter, this is the cause for which I'm willing to kill for. People who've marched into war, that's the kind of excitement they have. But when it is a just cause, as we felt it was really a very exciting moment.
A group of young people, as you say, and there was hysteria, there was joy, there was excitement. But at that point, when you realize that you have finally arrived in this country, you fought hard, millions of people have died or are lying dead in the streets of Rwanda. What was the first thing on the agenda that you wanted, or the movement wanted to achieve?
In a way, having this kind of conversation almost 30 years later, we have the benefit or the luxury of looking back and posing the question, if we had known all that would happen subsequently, would I have been that excited? Would I have made similar commitments, knowing that at the end of the Civil War and at the end of the genocide, we look back from that stretch of time from 1959 up to then, actually, and then you realize that you've lost probably over 1 million people. We do not know because we've not fully accounted for how many people have died since the Hutu Revolution of 1959, what happened in the 1970s when a military regime took over, and what happened during the Civil War and the genocide and up to now. So in retrospect, we do not know how many people that have died from all these successive changes that have taken place in Rwanda. And so in 1994, however, if you see the difficult situation that the RPF inherited of a country completely devastated from the tragedy of the killings that claimed the lives of Tutsis, claimed the lives of Hutus. The country was emptied of its entire population, either as internally displaced people or the waves of refugees that spilled into Zaire, which is now Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tanzania. Absolutely no services in the country, the economy in ruins, there are no hospitals, there are no schools, and there are all these dead bodies across the hills and dogs simply roaming the hills. And so it was absolutely a very, very difficult situation. And so the challenge at that point in time was, how do you get your act together to have a semblance of a nation, to have a semblance of an administration, and to have a population going back? So there were all these emergency issues, security issues, and subsequently, of course, that's the kind of road that we had to undertake. The moral of the lesson is that you never understand. You can start a war, but you never understand how it is going to end, and you cannot fully comprehend its consequences.
President Paul Kagame has been on record saying that he does understand, obviously, and feels for the families that lost their loved ones, the lives that were lost in 1994 genocide, but that there was a price to pay for the freedom that eventually the RPF brought after July 1994. Does he have a point that there will always be a cost at a war, and this was that cost for the freedom?
Yeah, there's always freedom is not free, certainly. That's a lesson that across history and across cultures and civilization that if you're a good student, you come to understand. But I wish also Kagame was able to fully understand that for the price of freedom to be justified, there would have to be freedom at the end of the price that a whole nation has had to undertake. And I mean the whole nation. It's not only Tutsis, it's the Tutsis and Hutus and Twas, whom we do not normally even talk about. And the problem I think that Rwanda faces today is that we've paid a very heavy price, but we are yet to achieve freedom. And I think that is where Kagame makes his analysis very, very limited for, of course, for very selfish reasons. But if I was to say, yes, there has been all these tragic losses of life in Rwanda, there has been this major disruption in Rwanda that has also touched the lives of the region, our neighbors in the region, then I would say, yes, for the price of war and the price of genocide, here we are 30 years later, we are at least beginning to enjoy the fruits of freedom. And certainly that has not happened. We've paid the price, but we are yet to obtain freedom in our country.
Let's go back to 1994. You are finally in country and slowly it's being rebuilt. And in 1996, you were appointed Rwandan ambassador to United States of America. Tell me more about that time and what it was for you to be appointed ambassador for your country, which you had left at such a young age.
I was not actually happy about it, to be very honest, because here you are, you've never been to your country, because I was only 1 year old when one of my parents, my father, was killed in the violence that took place at that particular time. So I have been a refugee since I was 1 year old. And I've been in my country for no more than 10 years in the total time I've been on this planet, 61 years now. And so when we landed in Kigali, like everyone else, I had hoped that I would enjoy the country, discover its hills, discover the people, go to places that I was born, meet whoever was surviving out of my relatives that were left behind. Many of them were killed during the genocide. And so when Kagame called me to his office and told me that since I had worked on the diplomatic circuit since 1991, building the relationship with organizations and United States State Department and working with United Kingdom to establish the kind of relationship that we've had to enjoy subsequently between these two countries. When he mentioned that to me, of course, we were taught during the revolution, that is what we called it, and we called each other comrades at that point in time. You do not choose what you do. So when he mentioned that he was posting me to United States, I said, yes, sir. But in my heart, and had just got married. I'd just got married in 1995. And so here I was with my bride and shipped to the United States. And yes, that was the kind of, on the one hand, I felt that, yes, there was a lot of work to do on the diplomatic circuit to build support for this new government. But here I was also newly married and never having achieved that dream of discovering my country, which was the dream of everyone.
You say you were not very happy when he called you into his office to say, Theogene, I am deploying you to Washington. You're going to be our man, our face in America. And you said you felt, or the only thing you could say was, yes, sir. What could have possibly happened if you had said no? Or could you have said no?
It was not even, those are things, looking back, once again, that is almost coming to 30 years. That's something that would not even cross your mind. Because I also, not only was I a cadre, a political cadre in the movement, I was also in that army, the Liberation Army, the Rwandese Patriotic Army, because initially the work I did was as a doctor on the battlefield. I'm a physician by training, so I was a doctor on the battlefield. I treated wounded comrades, And so because of that, I had a rank of major in the military. So your boss, the general does not say, this is where you're going, and then say, oh, excuse me, could you please revise this, or I do not want. No, did not even cross my mind, because that's not how you conduct business in a liberation movement, and that's not how you do business in the military. And so I accepted it as a challenge, but in my heart, I wasn't also very happy about it, but that's what it was.
So now you are in Washington, you're able to use your diplomatic ties. You've spoken to various other Western figures. How was that relationship with coming from Rwanda? What was the Rwandan approach? What was the Rwandan approach to Western governments, Western stakeholders that you were seeking to be working with?
Remember, that is in 1994, in the aftermath of the genocide, and so there was a deep sense of betrayal and anger by almost all of us, because we felt that the world had actually chosen to look the other way when Rwandans were at their most the pressing hour of need in our time. That's how we felt that kind of deep sense of betrayal. And I remember when I went to present my credentials to President Clinton, the President of the United States at that time, I truly remember in my heart, of course, you smile, and I entered with my newly wedded wife, and President Clinton has a charming part to him that puts you at ease. He says, "Oh, I hear that you've been recently married." I said, "Yes, sir." So, but in my heart, I was feeling really a lot of anger towards him, because him, President Clinton, more than anybody else in the international establishment, was actually responsible for the abandonment of the United Nations force that was in Rwanda, and the whole international community literally looking the other way as Rwandans were butchered day by day for the next 100 days. And so I felt anger, and we developed really a very smart way of always harping on the guilt of the international community. Every time anybody tried to criticize the things that we're doing or not doing, we always say, where were you in 1994? So that sense of guilt and the benefit of doubt that the world wanted to give us, and you might also say a lot of sympathy for Rwanda at that point in time, were more or less very welcome gifts in our hands. It was like manna in our hands, and we used it effectively to make sure that we get support for what we're doing, but we also used it to silence any criticism towards some of our policies or some of our actions.
So this guilt that you in this position as ambassador to Washington, you're meeting former President Bill Clinton, and you're using it as well as obviously the government in Kigali is doing. And you're talking about also using it to silence the critics or criticism that Rwanda was receiving at the time. What kind of criticism? Can you give us examples of things that were being said or done that you and the government and President Kagame were able to say, well, where were you in 1994 when our people were being killed?
Yeah, I could give 2 or 3 examples. One was that because there was so much killings that took place, the genocide against Tutsi in 1994, the world seemed to buy our idea that the killings were only against the Tutsis. But the other side that the voices were beginning to be heard was that, look, it is true that Tutsis were killed, but in the course of the campaign from the beginning of the civil war in 1990, DRPF army also was responsible some human rights abuses. And later on, even people would say war crimes, crimes against humanity. And by the time we go to the first Congo War and the second Congo War, there was also this mention of possible acts of genocide by later on by a number of reports, especially by the UN mapping report of 2010. And so this whole notion, people started saying as early as 1994 that, there is, we need to look at what you are doing within the country. And of course, we're not comfortable. We're not comfortable anybody looking at our records. And we were very, very smart and very efficient in trying to hide. But some of these things, you cannot hide them forever. That was one, our human rights records. Two, there was also the whole notion of building the basis for reconciliation in the country, the basis for healing, and also the basis for beginning to undertake some kind of governance reforms or democratic reforms that would open the space in slowly by slowly beyond the government of national unity that we had established at that point in time. Now, given the difficult of the ethnic component of our politics, we had some Hutus in the government, but by 1995, we had more of the people that we had co-opted into this experiment of national unity had dropped out. The prime minister, who was a Hutu, had dropped out. A number of Hutu ministers had dropped out, and were receiving a lot of criticism that we're running a show, a military show, and becoming intolerant to the fact that we needed to, open the political space and govern with others. So this was a second criticism that we had. And the third, of course, developed for in the rest of 96, 97, and almost up to now. But at that time, the first Congo War happened when I was in Washington, D.C. The second Congo War happened when I was in Washington, D.C. And all these things were piling up, and there was a lot of criticism. And our standard response to that would always be, we know how to look after ourselves. We have known that the hour of need, you, the international community, ran away from us. So we take the matter into our own hands, and you have no justification to criticize us because where were you in 1994? So those are some of the few examples I can give.
So what did you want, the Rwandan government at the time, when you were in Washington and the diplomatic ties were being rebuilt? What did Rwanda want from Western governments at that time?
The first one was really not to criticize us. So I remember my presence in Washington, D.C. was really spent on almost 4 years, 3.5 years, but it was more or less, putting down fires of all the things that kept on coming, criticizing us. But fortunately, I think for the United States and the United Kingdom, which have become for the last almost 3 decades the principal backers of the government in Kigali, increasingly we knew how to deal with them, and because they also had other interests in our government and in our country and in our region, fortunately they learned also to play along. And the major things that we needed, first of all, was that the fact that nobody would criticize us, and people would support whatever we're doing. And I think we received quite generous support from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from the international community, especially the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, because we really needed to to get services back working, to have an economy running, resettling the refugees. So we had an extremely busy agenda in terms of reconstruction and the development of Rwanda.
And how did they respond to you, these Western governments and leaders, to your demands?
As I said, the United States and the United Kingdom took the lead, really, as, of course, very powerful voices in the international community in supporting us almost wholesale, without unquestioningly, really. It was like they kind of gave us a blank check, which, of course, has come back to hurt Rwanda years later, because that substantial leverage which these two countries had could have been used to prod Rwanda, to prod the party RPF, and to prod especially Kagame, to move slowly by slowly towards opening up the political space, building up, possibilities for respecting the fundamental rights of the people, opening up the press freedoms, all these things, building a civil society and building institutions that are accountable, not, hostage to absolute rule as it is right now of one man. But we lost that kind of opportunity because I think notably the international community moved along that path of, moving beyond, rather being hostage to the guilt of what the international community didn't do, and acquiescing literally to whatever Kagame wanted to do. They gave him substantial resources were obtained, and thanks to all these resources, Rwanda was able to stand up a bit, although those resources could have been used more equitably, which is not in the case of Rwanda today.
You are one of the very few people who've actually been with President Paul Kagame from day one, from he was the leader in the movement, the Liberation Army, to when he became president. What is he like?
President Kagame is a man with many faces. I would say that we human beings tend to have many faces. In the case of Kagame, I would say that he has two sides to him. There is one side of Kagame that you would actually like working with such a person, with such a character, because he's very efficient, he's very passionate on the things that he's working on. He's very much operationally minded and a man of detail. Sometimes he would amaze me how much detail he would have, or he would ask me. And I always ask myself, well, I'm not even the president of this country, but I wouldn't have time to look, on the one hand, the big picture of a country, and then be able to go to these details of what is happening in the lives of individuals and families and communities, to the last detail of what happened, in places, things that I simply even now do not have time for. But he does. He has the mind of an intelligence officer, and sometimes an intelligence officer of the lowest rank who goes to some minor details, and also an intelligence officer of somebody who runs an intelligence organization. So he's efficient. He has passion for what he does. He is absolutely efficient, and his efficiency, of course, runs both ways, in doing good things as well as doing bad things. But there is that side, which I would say one side of him that is positive. But the other side is a dark side of a man who I have always wondered whether it's because of his past, but and every one of us has a past, and it's not that those who have suffered end up being inclined to do bad things to other people because of the trauma that we've had since childhood. We've been refugees. We've seen people die, our own. We've seen all these bad things happen. And so sometimes I try to say maybe this is what has happened to him, but he's a man who is extremely, extremely violent and who gets a kick out of inflicting pain on other people, and not simply strangers, but sometimes people in his own organization, his own military, his own colleagues in the political dispensation, in the political organization, in his government, ordinary people. I have witnessed situations where President Kagame beats his own generals or ridicules in public his colleagues, or is overjoyed when he's describing, people whom by now everybody knows that he's responsible for killing. And he describes it with a bit of amusement and glee. And so there is that side of violence, of wanting retribution, of wanting revenge, and getting a kick out of inflicting pain on other people, essentially like serial killers. And so I have always wondered how he reconciles these attributes within himself. And I think there is no doubt that increasingly they have a heavy toll. They do impose a heavy toll on his decision making and on how he's running the country.
So you say efficient, detailed, passionate, but on the same side of the other side of the coin, an extremely violent man, you said. That is the man that runs the country. That is the politician. That is the army. That's the general. But in private, you must have been at parties with him. You must have, sat down and kicked back. What is he like in private when he's not the president of the country? He's just Paul.
In a way, I have dealt with him in very difficult situations. And so whenever we interacted, especially I think there are other people who would be with him and I could see his guard is down, it's a bit more relaxed. But with me, it has always been very business, and I think we always took each other very serious. He respected me, I respected him, and we did not, I never went to visit him like privately, nor did he come to my house privately as he did other people in the country. But I've observed him with other people when his guard would be down, and he would be making jokes with other people, and other people making him laugh. But otherwise, and he has a very, beautiful family. He loves his kids, and his wife. You can see that he cherishes being around his family. And I've always asked myself, that's exactly what all of us would like to have time down when we can be with our family, with our God, and do, serious things that, families, fathers and children and wives can do. And sometimes I wonder, why would he take away that joy from other families whose members, whose fathers, and these are not simply just a few individuals. If you look at the human rights record of the regime he has presided over in these several years, you realize how many people out there who have tears, who have sorrow, who have trauma, because they have lost their loved ones thanks to the kind of iron hand with which Kagame rules the country. So in private moments, he's just like everyone else, but increasingly because of all these things that pile up, there's a lot of pressure on him, and he has a very narrow circle of true friends. I really, if you ask me who is Kagame's true friend outside his family, I wouldn't mention one. I wouldn't right now, because most of the people who in the past happened to be very close as friends, they have ended up very badly, either in exile or dead or in jail. So that's something that I find quite interesting.
And at what point did you change your mind or your belief in the RPF?
I would say that in the year 2000 I was an insider. So if I mentioned that, I was an outsider who was watching all these things happen, that would be honest of me. The truth of the matter, I was an insider, having been the general secretary, an ambassador to United States, and Kagame's chief of staff. I was truly an insider. And so, but the strange thing of being an official in Rwanda is that sometimes you can be an insider, and yet there are also many, many strange things and intimate things that may not be in the province of your knowledge, things that you know very well. So for me, I have always operated on the external circuit since 1991 when I started going out of liberated areas and going to other African countries, to Europe and to America. Since that time, I have really been on the move. Even as Secretary General, I served a very brief period from the signing of the peace agreement in 1993, August 1993. And then at the end of 95, I was made ambassador. So I was outside the country again on the diplomatic circuit. And I came back. During those 4 years, I was Kagame's chief of staff. It's the period that I came to understand a little more about what was going on, both in the party, what was going on in the government, and what was going on, especially with the army in the Congo. And that's when I started developing cold feet that really, having gone through civil war and genocide, is this all? And then, of course, the constitution-making process and the first elections of 2003, it kind of, I'm sure maybe some listeners may have, in the course of time when they were still young in college, may have read, especially if they were blacks from Africa, Caribbean, Europe, they might have read, the two books that had a strong impact on me, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, and another one which was like our Bible by Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. And I remember some of the things described in The Wretched of the Earth and Walter Rodney's book describing the post-colonial regimes. And they'll say, oh my God, we are building such such regime slowly by slowly, and the cult of the personality and the party that becomes, simply a rubber stamp and the increasing reliance on the military to do stuff that should otherwise have been done by civilians, and crowding everyone out of political space and all these killings that were taking place. So I started developing cold feet, but I was also, and I started developing this sense that, like the person who was mostly, for certain periods, I was the most vocal in defending the government. And if you go to BBC of that time, or VOA of that time, you hear my voice a lot, or you look at the media. If you Google my name, you find that I was very vocal in defending. So here I was, in my heart, feeling that some of the things that were attributed to our party and our government were wrong, and in public, I'm defending them. And so it was like I was leading a double life, the public life of lies to a certain extent, and also a private life that was increasingly questioning my conscience about my future, about how I would account for my life ultimately, of the things that at some point would say, oh, Theogene, you are all part of these bad things that have happened. And so it was in the year 2000 that I started developing this inner questioning of my conscience, that probably it was my time to go and figure out how else I could live.
So did you then have a fallout with President Kagame and the government, or it was just your personal feeling that you could no longer uphold this public face of lies that you had been doing, defending the indefensible according to you?
No, it was this. I had to. Now, if you worked close to Kagame, you fully understand that the option of living at will as a question of your choice, it does not exist. And I knew the dangers associated with that. So, in a way, my diplomatic skills were quite handy. When I needed them most, I had to plot my own exit, but always calculating to make sure that I do not step on sensitive grounds that could endanger me. And by then I had a wife, I had 4 children, and so I had to figure out how I could exit, and the way I put it to him at the end of 2004 was that I wanted to go for a sabbatical for 1 year. And he promptly gave me the permission to go, and in fact, he gave me a ticket to go to the United States. But while I was there, I think, and this is what happens in the courts of power. I'm sure some other people whispered into his ear that probably Theogene is exiting for good, and maybe he's plotting a comeback now to oppose you. I don't know what. I'm just speculating. I have no idea. But my troubles began when I went out, because he then repeatedly called me back to the country. And by early 2005, and at some point I was put in jail briefly, and then followed a period of back and forth. In 2005, he ordered that I should be investigated for disrespect to him, disrespect to Commander-in-Chief, and corruption. And so all these things happened. I went through the military court process. I was acquitted of all charges. Still, he could not allow me to leave the country. And but ultimately, because we have the same friends here in the United States, the same friends that I had actually made for him, for the country to be specific, but I introduced him to all these friends. They actually intervened on my behalf, and he then allowed me to leave the country. So it was not an easy way of exiting, but while I was in the country, I wrote to him a letter, probably I'll send you a copy of the letter, or I sent it to one of your colleagues, in which I resigned. I said, I'm resigning from the party, I'm resigning from the government, and could you please also relinquish me of the military titles I have? It was very funny, because in 2010, when I was now in exile, I had been in exile for 5 years in the United States, and I co-authored a pamphlet in which we evaluated our own government. And these are my colleagues who were former very good friends and close to Kagame. We wrote a paper called Rwanda Briefing, in which we were warning him that the country was sliding into the same anarchy and dictatorship that had caused repeated civil wars and had been the main cause of the genocide as well. And he sentenced all of us. He tried all of us in absentia. He sentenced me to 24 years in jail, and then finally he dropped the rank of major that I had in the military, which I had actually asked for in 2005. So I got it, but under different circumstances. So that's how I kind of exited from working with Kagame.
So did you ever think that you'll be in this position you are in now which is effectively the opposition. You are no longer in favor. You are criticizing the same very people that you fought alongside with some 30 years ago.
Yeah, I never could have thought it would end up like this. And I only wish it was on me. If it was on me, I could then say, oh, probably Theogene, there's something wrong with you. You are perpetuating the opposition to something. I've of course fought the previous regime which committed genocide, and I'm fighting this regime that I co-found, that I contributed to its founding in the early stages. And I wish I was the only person saying this, but this kind of voice of protest is widespread within Rwanda, only that they don't have the same luxury, the same rights as we do have to be able to speak out when we're out of the country. And it's a voice of protest outside the country, amongst Hutus, amongst Tutsis, and their voices of protest even with the region and to whom also Kagame's regime has caused untold suffering, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I wish I was alone, but I'm not. And the one thing that truly shocks me is because during a struggle you kind of with some kind of comradeship, friendship. I cannot even describe somebody who has not gone through these liberation movements. It will be very difficult to understand that kind of friendship that is forged amidst war, amidst catastrophe. And to see that Kagame would actually move to kill people whom he fought with, imprison people he fought with, including myself, because I've survived assassination attempts by Kagame's agents, and he has sentenced me literally to life, 24 years in jail, for simply telling him that a good advisor would normally give somebody. And so all these things shock me, that somebody who values his own life and the life of his own family would find it very easy to take the lives of others and deny them, and deny the country actually an opportunity to move beyond the civil war in which we paid every price, and the genocide and the kind of killings that have taken place in Rwanda and in the Congo, to move beyond that and say, okay, all these things are in our past. We're now building a new dispensation in which healing and reconciliation and democratization and respect for life and equitable socio-economic development could take place in the country. So I only shudder that somebody who knows how much sacrifice has been given would be the first one to lead a process in which all these basic things are denied to the citizens of Rwanda. That shocks me profoundly.
And this assassination attempt that you talk about, how many have there been on your life since you left?
Oh, the first one, the first one that almost happened when I was still in Rwanda was in 2005. They almost tried to engineer kidnap me from a church service in the presence of my wife and children. It's only that it happened to be a church, and I kind of resisted it, and my wife and others got alert about it, and so they dropped it. And subsequently, I have the ones that I know. The problem is that we never know what they are always plotting to do. But since 2013, I think I've survived 2 of them. And it's only that sometimes we're alerted by the governments in these countries where we're in exile, and probably he does not have as much a free hand as he does, especially in African countries.
And which countries were you in the two times that your life was subsequently alerted that there was an attempt to it?
In Belgium, twice.
So what kind of evidence was there that somebody was attempting to kill you?
It's always said that, once again, it's a British Lord Acton, I believe, who said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's very true, and I've witnessed it. And when you have absolute power, it breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds impunity. The person involved in the attempting to assassinate me is no other than the current chief of police in Rwanda, David Munyuza, and is on record and have furnished to the intelligence organizations of these countries, and it's out there in public. It's only that in Kenya, Rwanda, you wouldn't be able to, but we've done a transcript, and I've transcribed it and translated in English so that people can see it. But these are several, over 100 audio in which this chief of police is plotting with somebody actually to kill me. It's only that this person, I think, dropped maybe some sympathy for me and decided to go along and kept on furnishing us with the information. And so they no longer hide it. And it's the same person involved in the attempt to assassinate General Kayumba Nyamwasa, Rwanda's former chief of staff for the army in South Africa. They are the same people involved repeatedly, time after time, in the assassination of critics, especially and including the killing of my former colleague Patrick Karegeya, who was assassinated in South Africa at the end of 2013. So they are this arrogant and act with impunity because there's no accountability for the crimes they are doing.
And in those recordings, briefly, can you just give us an example of a sense of what is being plotted to be done to you?
So in one plot, they are plotting. They know that I'm going to take a flight from the United States to the Netherlands, to Holland, and they are plotting. They have tried to buy some people, some truck drivers, and colluding with the people who will be driving me to understand my location. And this the truck driver is going to follow us and at some point bump our car off the road, and then some people, are going to simply finish me off. In one, that is what the assassination plot is talking about. And they have used auto accidents like that within Rwanda for some people who've died in those kinds of circumstances. But in the other, very gruesome kind of plot, they would inject me with heavy doses of heroin, and then they would dismember my body and put it in a briefcase, and then they would go and dump these body parts somewhere in a river in France. But it goes on for months. The plotting goes on for months, and nobody has even called Dan Munyuza, the chief of police, or Kagame to account for all these things. And all these assassination plots, successful ones, unsuccessful ones, they all go right to Kagame himself. He's the one who dishes out the money for these operations. He's the one who fully understands, and he has described, like in the case of this kidnap of Responses Vagina of Hotel Rwanda, Kagame described it as a flawless operation. Once again, as I said, he's a very efficient guy who, moves with passion until he achieves his objective. He loves these flawless operations. So to him, when he takes out Theogene, he takes out somebody else, he calls it a flawless operation, and he actually gets a kick out of it.
Are you safe now, or do you feel safe?
I'm never 100% safe, but I've also chosen to lead a life. I have a family. My family lives in fear too, because every time I step out of the house, they do not know what is going to happen to me, and you live with this kind of cloud hanging over you, your shoulders, over your head, looking left and right. You live a life of isolation because you tend to fear, especially what all this does, the climate of fear that Kagame has inflicted on the population of Rwanda, both within and outside, and our neighbors, is that he has a long arm that can reach anybody, and he brags about it in public. And he has bragged about, the killing of one minister, Setsenda Shonga, who was part of the first breed of Hutu politicians who joined the RPF in the 90s. He was in the first government in 1994. Recently, he said he crossed the line, and he was literally bragging in public that, so what if I killed him? Or the same with Patrick Karegeya, whom he assassinated in South Africa. So he keeps on and he says it in Kinyarwanda. When he says it in Kinyarwanda, it conveys a lot of meaning that all of us are not beyond reach. And he wants to convey that kind of message to each one of us, that he'll keep on trying, and he'll keep on trying, and that he's going to succeed. That's the message he gives. So I'm never 100%, safe, and I'm told once in a while by these governments where we are that we should be careful. But taking care of yourself to the extent that you become paranoid, paralyzed by fear, that's not the kind of life I want to lead. And I go about my business and take the necessary precautions and leave the rest to, I'm a believer, I leave the rest to God.
These are the same governments that are warning you, your life is at stake, your life is in danger, be careful. But at the same time, they're still upholding, they're still supporting Paul Kagame and the government of Rwanda. Make that make sense to our
listeners. Doesn't. No, it doesn't make sense. I wish it could make sense to me. And I have gone back to the same government and say, but you are telling me to be careful. You have all this information. You are not telling me that this is not true, because this is 100% foolproof evidence. And you are also telling me to be careful. So why would you support somebody like that? And in one case, let me give this anecdote so that people understand. There's this whole, people say it's a controversy over who shot down the plane that was carrying the president of Rwanda. People say it's a controversy, but amongst the Rwandans and amongst people who are members or who were members of the RPF, who shot down the president is not a matter of debate. We all know that our army and President Kagame gave the order, our intelligence did the footwork, and it's our missiles that shot down the plane that killed the president of Rwanda and the president of Burundi, or the people who were with them. And that is the landmark event that triggered the genocide. Didn't cause, but triggered the subsequent events. Of course, ended up RPF being in power, but ended up claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of Tutsis, and subsequent processes that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of Hutus as well. But when you, for example, look at that event in which he's responsible for doing something like that, it was later in 2011, because I had discussed this same issue with the president himself after it happened in 1994, and he had told me that we had done it, and it was only two of us alone. And although I knew even by then that we had done it, even from my own young military escorts would tell me, what had happened, which means that most people in the army and in the political establishment of RPF knew what had happened. So when I went over here to State Department in the United States, I made a statement in 2011. They wanted to meet me, and one of the senior officials asked me, said, Theogene, why are you telling us this? I said, I'm telling you because it is also for me. I want to let off the burden of holding that in my mind, but I'm also telling you so that this whole confusion, the French investigation and the fact that an event that triggered something so tragic will not be investigated by anybody, and nobody would hold Kagame accountable for that, bothers me, because that's how impunity is built, and that's how dictatorships are built. And I'm telling you that because you also need to change your policies towards Rwanda to understand exactly what happened. And then he said, but you understand that is very difficult, because to indeed make us change a very privileged relationship, especially in which President Kagame also does good things for us. I said, like what? He said, peacekeeping, and is a strategic ally in a turbulent region. I say, yes, you cannot say that. You can say that, but on the other hand, you cannot say that you do not know. I'm telling you this so that many, many years from now, or a few years from now, when other tragedies visit Rwanda, and we have another civil war, and several hundreds of thousands or millions are killed, and the region suffers another catastrophe, as we are now repeatedly witnessing the suffering in the Democratic Republic of Congo, then you cannot claim that you did not know. Because I recall at the airport in 1998, I was still ambassador here, visit by the late Madeleine Albright and written by President Clinton in Kigali. President Clinton says that they didn't know how much people were being mowed down day by day for 100 days in 1994. So nobody can claim, you cannot claim later that you didn't know. So that is why I'm telling you this truth today. This is what happened, yeah. So do you think... I'm always surprised that, but in diplomacy they call it realpolitik, yes.
And so should these governments, the Western governments, do more? Because you spoke about a country where there is very little political space, there's no openness to democracy. Should these Western governments be doing more to influence democracy in Rwanda?
They should do more, but absolutely they have decided to do much less. Take an example of, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has simply come back from Rwanda for the CHOGM, for the Commonwealth meeting of heads of governments and states, the so-called CHOGM. He made a speech in which that he's so impressed by Kagame's performance, Rwanda's performance, and he said it has undergone absolute transformation. Absolute transformation. This is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom has been a principal backer, budget support year after year for the last 30 years to Rwanda, and knows a lot about what is going on in Rwanda. And sometimes in its own reports, it talks about what is going on in Rwanda. And so when you have a government that gives a blank check to a regime like that, it can only be one of two things. Either it's because there's something that it receives in return, irrespective of the bleak picture of human rights and democratic process within Rwanda, the state of press freedoms and civil society freedoms, or it could only be that they consider that Africans, in any case, we deserve much less than other societies, that somebody like Kagame is actually good for Rwanda because Rwandans shouldn't expect, more from their leaders. And so it's not of ignorance, it's not out of ignorance. They know what is taking place in Rwanda, but simply choose to ignore it. In this case, of course, Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his colleagues have received a commitment from Rwanda that it will receive refugees that the United Kingdom does not want. And so, and of course, there are other geostrategic issues which we've not discussed in this conversation that make Rwanda very, very useful to the United Kingdom and to France right now, and to the United States. And I believe probably even Russia and China will be approaching Rwanda at this pace.
Do you have any regrets that it took you so long to be able to speak up and out against the government of President Paul Kagame?
Yeah, I do. I wish, I only wish I'd spoken earlier. But then I also try to understand my own situation in this way. I was, if you see the period I was in the RPF and in the government, it's a period between 1990 and 2004. So that's a period of only 14 years. And most of these 14 years, I was out of the territory. I was moving in and out of the territory controlled by the RPF, and I was mostly out of Rwanda. So the concentrated years I was in Rwanda was the 4 years I served as President Kagame's chief of staff. So 14 years is not, given where we start from, was not a long time enough for me to fully understand all the things that were going on within the RPF and within the government and within all the things that I've been trying to describe. And plus, they developed slowly by slowly. And plus, being Tutsi, there was a period of time when there was this collective doom that was always hanging on us, especially considering 1994. We've suffered genocide, our relatives have been butchered, and you always give ourselves the benefit of doubt and Kagame that yes, he has all these rough edges, maybe he will outgrow them, but for now we need him, we need each other because it's collective survival. I'm trying to give the kind of thinking that kept on, cropping up in my mind. Then I would suppress it. I say, okay, let's give it a little more time. But looking back, I think probably if there had been an opportunity to exit, because once again, you cannot speak out and remain in the country. You can only speak out if you're out of the country, because to do so within the country, it's a death sentence or a prison sentence. That's not how it happens in Rwanda. But sometimes in my own private moments, I said, should I have done this earlier? And then I asked myself, but how could I have done it earlier? So it's those what ifs of things that happen in life, and you look back and you say, I wish I had done this.
And you were the General Secretary of the RPF, the ruling party today in Rwanda. The President, Paul Kagame, has been in power for so long. And now, in the change of the constitution, which could see him become president beyond 2034, is there an heir apparent to the ruling of the RPF that you can see, or is there any plans at all?
No. First of all, a discussion of a heir apparent would be condemning that heir apparent to death, because the whole discussion of heir apparents does not exist with these types of regimes. The likes of Stalin, the likes of this young guy who runs North Korea, or the ones that we've known in Africa, Idi Amin and Mobutu of former Zaire, which is now Congo. All these dictators, the way they run the show is such that succession is a taboo subject. Because in democratic systems, organized systems, succession is through the ballot. In Britain, in here in the United States, in Canada, in all these democratic governments, succession rules are very clear. There is a constitution, there are laws, nobody's above the law, but this is not the case in Rwanda. Kagame is like an absolute monarch, even an absolute monarch who does not have constitutional constraints, institutional arrangements that kind of limit how much the absolute monarch can do. But he is an absolute monarch who has power over life and death and who runs the show the way he wants. And so the question of heir apparent does not emerge in Rwanda. And so this is where the fear is. That if you look at the trajectory of power, how power changes in Rwanda, it has always been violent. In the last 100 years, it has been from the last king before the coming of the Europeans, and then the revolution of 1959, the military coup of 1973, then the invasion of the RPF. If you look at this pattern, you can only see that succession in Rwanda is always a violent phenomenon. And that is my deepest fear, that when Kagame goes by, I do not know what means. If you are to use the same trajectory, you could, if I gave you that information and asked you what would happen in Rwanda next, you'd say most likely the regime in Rwanda today will end violently. You would probably be right. Not that it would happen, but that would be the logic outcome of what has been happening. And so my deepest fear is that there are all the necessary ingredients in Rwanda today that will eventually trip the country into another round of violence, of killings, even possibly of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And then the cycle continues because we've not been able to break the cycle of violence being the principal means by which power passes on from one generation to the next or from one administration to the next. That is my deepest fear.
Thank you very much.